This is sensational. We attacked the Russian Novovoronezh nuclear power plant. Several power units are currently shut down. Defense forces also blew up the port of Novorossiysk with long Neptune missiles. It's the second largest oil export center in Russia. Everything is on fire. There were powerful strikes on the port, the oil terminals, and the missile unit. Cheskharis is a key export hub for Russia. It is engulfed in flames. Kalibr warehouses, coastal facilities, and a ship were hit. In the port, it's burning. The detonation lasted all night. Let's watch this footage. We also attacked energy facilities. Several power units at the Russian Novovoronezh nuclear power plant were shut down from the grid as a result of a powerful drone attack. While Russia is busy extinguishing Novorossiysk, its own mobilized troops continue to be eliminated at the front. A Russian blogger admits that just near Pokrovsk and Bakhmut, Russia has lost 100,000 Rushists.
And for just these two small towns, Russia has already sacrificed 80,000 to 100,000 of its soldiers.
The oil refinery in Saratov was attacked, and in Crimea, the largest operation by the defense forces, strikes on airfields, oil depots, and sea terminals in Feodosia and Sevastopol, explosions in Belbek, fires at drone warehouses, closed airports and airfields, and occupiers trembling with fear. The Ukrainian defense forces have carried out the largest operation in recent months. Strike drones and Flamingo, Bars, and Lyuty missiles operated simultaneously in several directions. Let's discuss these massive strikes by Ukraine's armed forces right now.
Yes, Dasha, I greet you and, of course, all your viewers.
Gennady Vladimirovich, what do you think? Right now we're striking key targets, oil refineries and energy facilities. Putin only targets residential buildings. Today there was yet another terrorist attack, and
this doesn't change. Russia is waging a terrorist war, a war it conducts using genocidal methods. Methods of genocide, that is, destruction based on nationality. Ukrainians are citizens of Ukraine regardless of their nationality, and in fact, this is the strategy, the tactic, and even the goal. And over there in Russia, no one ever hid the fact that the objective was to strip Ukraine of its national identity, to make it part of Russia, to conquer, to occupy, to install a puppet government. That was the goal of the so-called special operation from the very beginning. They thought it would be a week-long special operation. At most a week and a half, but those weeks or so have stretched into 4 years. That's why Putin is ruthless. He has no human empathy whatsoever. He is the very embodiment of evil in the world. I've been saying this for a long time, in almost every interview I give. Only Trump could look for a soul or human qualities in him, whether he's just pretending, excuse my unparliamentary language, or he really doesn't understand anything anymore. For open discussion. So what can be said? These are the sinister features of the Russian totalitarian regime today, this military junta represented by Putin. As for the strikes by the Ukrainian armed forces, it's clear that this is war. Ukraine is responding to Russian aggression, which has been ongoing for 4 years and aims to destroy the Ukrainian state as such. Therefore, all these strikes undoubtedly, I hope, are primarily targeting military and related infrastructure to weaken Russia's aggressive potential. But that's how I see it. Ukraine is not waging a terrorist war. Ukraine is a democratic state, despite all the difficulties of the current situation. That's why the approaches to waging war are completely different. Here we see blatant cruelty, simply the senseless destruction of people. Here we see attempts to weaken the military, economic, and industrial potential of the aggressor country. This is what sets Ukraine apart from Russia today, fundamentally sets it apart.
Gennady Ivanovich, we are attacking oil ports, Tuapse, Novorossiysk, and recently Ust-Luga, near St. Petersburg. And how do you assess this, first and foremost, from an economic point of view? Reuters has already reported that Transneft has stopped pumping oil to the port of Novorossiysk. How painful are these strikes for the Russian economy, for Putin, and for those in your Kremlin?
Look, here we are with you, giving lessons in truth. Once again, I want to emphasize that I am extremely interested in Ukraine's victory, in a military victory for Ukraine, the liberation of its territory, and the defeat of the aggressors. And by and large, this opens up the only opportunity for the collapse, the downfall of the Putin regime, and for us Russians who left the country under threat of torture, arrests, and so on, to return the country within our lifetime. Let's be clear, there is undoubtedly military, economic, and, I am convinced, political sense in striking at military and quasi-military targets, energy and other infrastructure, the export capabilities of the aggressor country, and so on and so forth, without question. Of course, this is damage to the Russian economy. Of course, these are serious, so to speak, losses on the part of the largest companies, ports, and so on. All of this is true. All of this has military and other significance. Because the front is not just the people fighting, tanks, artillery, and so on. It's the rear, it's fuel, it's equipment, it's medicine, it's heat, and so on. Because without all that, the army cannot fight. And by striking military infrastructure or near military infrastructure, the combat capability of the occupying army is weakened. Now let's look at how this affects Russia internally. I know there are a lot of economists who say it's a disaster, the plaster is coming off, the patient is leaving, everything is lost. A more precise analysis, I think I mentioned this on your show, is what our economists actually say. The economists we trust say that expertise must be absolutely objective and ruthless. If it isn't, then it's not real expertise. And this expertise, as of today, says that, of course, this causes damage to the aggressor, but it is not a key factor in weakening their aggressive plans or forcing them to make peace. There are problems, logistical, financial, organizational, technical, and so on, but they do not fundamentally affect the situation at the front or the aggressive intentions of the Putin regime. Now let's look at the everyday aspect. We've talked about this as well, and I monitor it in terms of how people live in Moscow, St. Petersburg, the Moscow region, and a number of other major cities. Major, I emphasize, metropolises of Russia, where the majority of the population lives. Well, I'll just give you some statistics. In Moscow, there are at least 12 million people. In the Moscow region, over 7 million, and in reality, it's even more. So, roughly speaking, about 20 million people live in the Moscow region. Then you add St. Petersburg with 7 million, then Nizhny Novgorod with 4 or maybe 5 million together with the region. Then let's take Novosibirsk and so on. So, roughly speaking, if we take the 10 largest metropolises, at least half of the population of the Russian Federation lives in them. At least, the war isn't felt there. That's where the war isn't felt. And that's exactly where the main public response happens. Well, maybe soon it will start to be felt there. Maybe, indeed, the intensity and systematic nature of the strikes on the Russian energy and fuel complex will start causing serious disruptions even in major metropolises, but for now, that's not the case. At least, I can vouch for St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the Moscow region. Their gas stations still have no problems with fuel. Gasoline has gone up in price by about 10%. It used to be around 60 rubles, now it's 66. If we're talking about budget gas stations along the highway, it's a bit more expensive there. There are no problems with goods, no problems with services, no problems with work, no problems with leisure, no problems getting children into kindergartens or schools, and so on. Basically, there might be some issues somewhere, but I'm talking about life in the metropolises, the big cities, the major ones, where the main social and political life is concentrated. There are no such problems there, and there's no sense of war either, because someone somewhere at their own risk signs a contract and goes off to fight and kill Ukrainians of their own free will. And if they get killed in return, well, frankly, no one really feels sorry for them. There's no widespread mourning across Russia for those dying at the front, even though, as we know, the losses are horrific. There's no point in hiding it. That's just how it is. You just have to remember the Second World War. In World War II, Britain lost 660,000 people. The United States of America lost, roughly speaking, 500,000. Even Germany, which fought the whole world for 6 years and bore the main burden of the war, along with the monstrous carpet bombings and shelling of cities, with direct artillery fire, lost 7.5 million people. The current losses of the Russian army, in my opinion, I emphasize, exceed, for example, the losses of Britain in the entire Second World War over all 6 years. Such losses are monstrous, but in Russia, people have become accustomed to not valuing the life of a citizen. That is, a citizen's life is worth absolutely nothing, except for the money that is thrown to them from the master's table. And so as of today, this is limited. You see, Russia is waging a limited war against Ukraine. just so you understand. For Russia, this is a local, limited war. Russia is spending about 7.3% of its gross domestic product on this war. That includes defense spending, army supplies, and regional budgets. The agency, spends about $170 to $180 billion a year. That's about 7.3%. That's about 7.3% of Russia's GDP. You can recalculate it. Maybe I might be off by a small amount in the details, but if you take Russia's GDP as 2 trillion, 7% of that gives us this figure, roughly 150 to 160 billion, which matches up. So what does this mean? With this kind of financial burden, Putin can continue the war for years to come. For years? This is an absolutely simple calculation, arithmetically accessible to third or fourth grade school children. Just take it and calculate. There are many well-known historical periods when countries wage wars, prepare for wars, or while carrying out rearmament programs, they spend 7, 8, even 12% of their GDP on the military, on defense, on preparing for war, and nothing happened to them. They didn't collapse, they didn't fall apart. It's also important to keep in mind that Russia, in addition, relies on a gigantic resource base, rich and diverse. And I'll tell you honestly, Dasha, even when I was deputy chairman of the Duma Committee on Security, deputy head of the faction party leader, I didn't understand how it was possible to keep robbing the country and why collapse never came. And then I realized that the country's monstrous wealth allows it to be plundered with impunity for centuries. That's it. And now this is working against Ukraine and against the whole world. This monstrous resource wealth of Russia. Although, to be honest, I think you and I don't want to repeat myself. I told you about that report, that case, right? I haven't told you yet.
You mentioned that you had a discussion, you had a meeting in Brussels, and there was a report there. Gennady Vladimirovich, the topic of Venezuela is very important because Pete Hegseth announced the start of Operation Southern Spear in Latin America. President Trump gave the order to act, and the US Department of Defense is carrying out the order. With this mission, they are defending our homeland. They are removing narco-terrorists from our hemisphere, defending our homeland from drugs that are killing our people. So it is assumed that the target of the operation will be the Maduro regime in Venezuela. And this is very interesting because you always say that oil.
It's called, thank God, a scabby sheep in the flock. Sorry for the unparliamentary expression. I have no doubts I fully support the actions of the United States of America against the bloody criminal Venezuelan regime of a leader who is completely entangled in international drug trafficking. I know this not from Kahyzent and not from any other open sources. 2 years ago, I met and have a good relationship with one of the senior officials in the Paris City Hall, a woman who has dedicated her entire life to international human rights advocacy. She told me about these drug cartels, about the involvement in the activities of drug cartels, not only of practically all totalitarian regimes, the leaders of almost all totalitarian regimes are involved in the activities of drug cartels. So, this Venezuelan leadership and so on, wherever there are drug trade routes and transportation paths, the entire country's leadership is usually involved in drug trafficking, of course. And I've known for a long time that the Venezuelan leadership, by and large, are drug lords, drug traffickers. And thank God if Trump manages to bring some order there now, at least do something, because he has already lost all his geopolitical battles. Well, maybe he hasn't lost them yet, but that's the direction things are heading. He lost to China, he lost to India, and he didn't finish what he started in the Middle East. And in many other areas, so to speak, he couldn't do anything in Russia, he couldn't help in Ukraine, or didn't want to help. Well, let him at least do something useful. Maybe they'll actually manage to change the regime there. But so that we don't have any more illusions here, our lessons, though bitter, unfortunately. So when Maduro decided to give up all the oil assets just so they'd leave him alone and give him guarantees so he wouldn't be killed, that's it. He was ready to give the Americans control over all the oil fields, all the oil resources, the oil refining and extraction industries. Experts did the math, they didn't mind the effort. To restore everything properly, just to put it all in order, all that they destroyed, everything they ruined there, just to get it back in shape and ensure a stable supply of oil to the world markets, it would take about 10 years. Well, let's say, fine, maybe the experts made some mistakes and the Americans will put in more effort, bring in some investments, but even then, it will still take at least 3 to 5 years for Venezuelan oil. And there's a huge amount of it, just like gas, and I think they're actually number one in gas for Venezuelan oil to make it to the market. By the way, Russia ranks 8th in terms of proven oil and gas reserves. Well, that might be due, so to speak, to poor geological exploration, which has also been ruined in Russia. Everything will have consequences eventually. But there's a huge inertia in this entire economy, industry, and all of oil production. So Russia is in 8th place, but the ministry, I think, is first or second in gas and in oil. Well, for this ministerial oil to actually reach the market, it will take at least another 3 to 5 years. That's the minimum. So this kind of a flood on the oil market or the replacement of Russian oil, which for now there's nothing to replace oil products with, this could happen, but only after years. And as you can understand, we might not have that much time. That much time is needed to bring in big money.
And you yourself have said, and all economists say, that the only chance to make Putin stop is a collapse in oil prices. Everyone says this is an important line. And when I have always asked Gennady Vladimirovich over the course of several years, what can be done? I was always given two words in response: Iran and Venezuela. Iran and Venezuela.
Well, as we can see, Iran is not an option. That would also take years. Now, a new stage of war is expected between, well, I would say Israel's just war against Iran, since the active enrichment of this uranium hidden from bombing continues in Iran. They can now bring it to weapons grade, and after that, it's just a matter of assembling warheads. So practically there is no. And since Iran has promised to strike Israel with its very first nuclear warhead, Israel, in general, has no choice but to intensify military actions against the rotten, completely criminal, I repeat, Iranian regime. Therefore, war there is practically inevitable. So Iran is unlikely to be able to supply oil to the market right now. And oil and gas make these countries wealthy. And of course, it would have been better to hit the regime right away instead of delaying. And maybe by now there would already be a different government there, since there is, so to speak, a crown prince who is ready to take on this power, and people are ready to give him this power. And he is, after all, a normal, pro-Western, adequate person. Maybe he's not much of a Democrat, but at least he would accept the terms put forward by the war coalition. As for Venezuela, well, it remains as it is. Therefore, for now, there is no real possibility not only to replace Russian oil, but even to bring the price per barrel below 50 euros. And again, our experts at this discussion, let me return to this question once more because it's important. This question was asked a year and a half ago in Sofia. Our experts were present at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and I was there as well. There was a meeting of two committees. At the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, so to speak, the deputies came, but when they started to explain in practice what was happening, what the resources were, what the costs were, and so on, they lost their enthusiasm. And then they asked, well, what could be a game changer? Tell us. Our experts told them, Dmitry Nekrasov spoke, by the way, that a collapse in oil prices could be such a factor. That is the only thing that could influence Putin. Everything else is just a half measure. There are always antidotes and countermeasures developed against them, and so on and so forth. As for Trump pushing for sanctions right now, just forget about it. That's just an excuse. It's not a solution to the problem, just an excuse. He says, look, I did everything, I imposed these sanctions, but nothing worked. Well, it's not my fault after all. Well, that's pretty much how it's going to be. Remember what we're saying today. And that's why right now it's impossible to bring the price down below $50 per barrel, because the composition of the global energy market has changed. The proportional makeup of the world's oil production has shifted. Now, about 20% of the oil produced and brought to market comes from shale wells. These shale wells account for 20%. That's a tremendous number. And at present, today's shale oil production simply can't be cheaper than $50 per barrel for now. Yes, technologies will probably develop. Yes, people will come up with new things. Humanity always improves everything. If you compare a car from 150 years ago to one today, you can see it. There's been huge progress, but it takes time. And that's why for now, no one will allow, excuse my cynicism, the price of oil to drop below $50 per barrel. Otherwise, the entire shale oil industry will come to a screeching halt, and that's a huge volume of oil present on the market. And first and foremost, shale oil is produced in the United States of America. So here, we also need to be realistic. They won't want to destroy their own oil industry. Yes, oil in America, in fact, all oil, even though America is, strangely enough, one of the leading countries in both exports and production, of course. But in America, oil only accounts for about 1.5% of GDP, if I'm not mistaken. Nevertheless, it won't allow that to happen either. Here too, we need to be realistic. And once again, I just want to remind our viewers that the share of oil revenues in the Russian budget has been decreasing every year. And over the past decades, it has dropped from 55% of budget revenues to 23% in 2025. We just need to understand that Russia's dependence on oil exports is decreasing. It's still very high, it's still very significant. Incidentally, because oil revenues pull along many other sectors with them, all of this gets distributed. Oil money goes to pay for everything: salaries, pensions, benefits, social programs. Of course, it's still a huge chunk, but it's not as gigantic as it was, say, 7 years ago. We also need to understand all these realities.
Gennady Vladimirovich, so what will Europe do in the near future? For now, Belgium is not ready to hand over the frozen assets. But I'm sure that Europe is just as smart as what you've just articulated now. They understand this perfectly well, the leaders.
They understand it perfectly well. Yes,
But they don't do anything.
they understand. They even understand perfectly well what a character Trump is. I'm putting it mildly. Yes.
So, what actions will Europe take in the near future? For now, the frozen assets are being transferred to us, and they don't plan to crash the oil market. And for now, Venezuela is still under the Maduro regime. You say it will take at least 5 years to organize.
The debt, well, to supply serious volumes. Yes.
So, accordingly, our analysis is about what will happen in the near future and how pressure will be exerted on Putin, taking into account all the factors you've mentioned.
I hope, first of all, that a trend will start to emerge in America, and it's already becoming clear there. Even though the Democrats scored their first victory in New York, they still managed to win. And now these midterm elections, well, they're already, yes, for now, they're next
Next fall in 26.
No. They've already started now at some municipal levels. There too, you can already see the Democrats making gains. Maybe not such a decisive one. I think public opinion in America will change. If Trump gets involved in the operation, let's be honest about it. I'm very interested in the success of Trump in Venezuela because I understand how dangerous any dictatorial regimes are that rely on force. But I'm not sure, and I don't know if the Americans will be able to quickly defeat Venezuela and change the government there. Because they're not just facing the Venezuelan military, that's one thing. They're also up against the Colombian cartels, which have tens of thousands of fighters in the tropics there. And the methods of guerrilla warfare are quite cunning. Will the Americans be able to quickly resolve the issue with the Venezuelan regime, Maduro's regime, or not? Of course, I wish them all the best, but if Trump gets bogged down there, it will be bad. It will be bad for everyone there. So right now, we should all wish them every success. And that's why opinions might change. First, in my view, attitudes toward Trump and his, so to speak, will start to change. Support for Ukraine. But still, Americans in general are inclined to help Ukraine, to defend Ukraine. After all, the vast majority of Americans understand that this needs to be done. Of course, there are also plenty of fringe elements, freeloaders, and people who don't understand, who say, why do we need this Ukraine? Just give us money somewhere else. But still, Americans are a very highly developed nation with a deep political background, with deep political experience. I think they will handle this situation, so I hope that the pressure on Trump to support Ukraine will continue to grow within America itself. The situation there is really difficult. What do we see? I think I told you, or maybe I mentioned it before, I have a friend in the Republican Party, a good one. We have to explain to Americans who Putin is. I said, David, what do you mean? He's been in power for 26 years. Americans have already forgotten who Putin is. Now we have to explain it all over again. Has a new generation already grown up?
They don't know.
Of course, an entire generation has grown up over these years, and they don't know anything about the submarine, or the murder of Nemtsov, or the dispersal of protests, or about Chechnya, or the storming of Beslan. They don't know anything. They say, we still have to do more. I said, wow, you guys? He says, yeah, we have nothing but news. We're a country with a geopolitical agenda. That's why we have Thailand, Sudan, Venezuela, and everything. And so in this stream of news, stories about Russia can definitely get lost. Obviously, the world doesn't revolve around Putin. That's why, actually, first of all, I think this is a change in America's own internal situation. I hope so. Second, there need to be some shifts in Europe. Yes, obviously right now is a very transitional period, whether it will be a rightward shift or a change of power, but in any case, as they say, charity begins at home, and the sense of threat and war simply can't fail to have an effect. I hope that in Europe, this understanding is already leading to some actions, though perhaps those actions are still insufficient in scale, in determination, and so on. I think Europe will bare its teeth, pardon the expression, it's not a paradox, truly, because right now, there is a growing interest in Europe's defense industry. Not to mention the interest of the American defense industry, which is, to use the Churov-style phrase, loaded to 146% with orders until some year in the 2030s. Now, the European defense industry is also starting to receive serious money. Who would turn that down? All the more so because objectively, rearmament is necessary. The only area where Europe is at a disadvantage, of course, is in nuclear confrontation in a potential nuclear standoff, but still 600 warheads. France and Britain together have 600, not the 6,000 that Russia has. In this area, they are at a disadvantage and can't make up for it, except by bringing the United States back to its usual allied relationship, to the sanctity of NATO. There is no other option. Not even China is an alternative here. He has already produced 600 warheads. It used to be 240. And now, according to the program, he's aiming for over 1,000. This means that his nuclear potential will soon become the third largest, if not the second, in terms of power and destructive capability. This is what's happening now, a negative trend that we haven't talked much about. No, well, America understands that its main geopolitical rival, in fact, the main rival for the whole world in the 21st century, will be China, but right now it's Russia.
At the moment, it's Russia, yes. I've prepared a segment for the end called The Social Situation in Russia. It's about the infighting between war correspondents and propagandists. So, what's going on? First of all, in St. Petersburg, for the first time in a long while, mobile communication was completely shut down, and it was reported that 5.7 million people were left without service. They started to complain. Secondly, Russian war correspondents are now openly going on social media and saying that there is a large-scale disposal of their fellow citizens. For example, one blogger wrote that in Pokrovsk and Bakhmut, Russia killed 100,000 of its own soldiers. Not Ukraine, but Russia itself killed them. What's going on? How many more Russians are they going to send to the slaughter? Attacks have started between Abdeludinov and Solovyov. The so-called SVO supporters are starting to go after Solovyov. There's a kind of snake pit infighting going on. Then there are the migrant protests, then the nationalist march, and on top of that, of course, musicians coming out against the Kremlin. All of this has become more active right now. How do you assess this turbulence in Russia?
Well, as a kind of loss of control over society. That is, there are certain segments of society that the authorities don't dare to suppress or touch, because they believe it could destroy a certain level of support that really does exist. Not everyone supports Russia, far from everyone. The war and Putin, but there are those who do support them. And apparently right now, this segment has started to boil over. Because, well, how long can you keep waging war when there are no results? After all, people are really going there and dying. Yes, those who aren't killing Ukrainians, of course, that's a war crime, no doubt about it. But over there, they're also dying in droves, and nobody cares about them. They're just dirt, dust over there. Those who sign contracts, they're doomed people. They're destined to die at the will of their commander. And the commander doesn't care how many die, as long as he's been ordered to take some house, a tower, or to cross to some shore or stream at any cost. He doesn't care. Russia has always fought this way, sending people against tanks and machine guns with nothing but bayonets. And it hasn't changed much now because results are needed. It's impossible to achieve results without heavy losses. So there will be heavy losses. And apparently this is starting to build up. You see, I've always been a proponent, not just a proponent, well, yes, you could say a proponent, of the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. I believe it manifests everywhere, in all areas, when quantitative factors accumulate, and at first they seem insignificant, invisible, but then suddenly, boom, something happens and the whole situation changes. This transformation of quantity into quality is a philosophical law that we once studied back in school. And it works. And right now, quantitative prerequisites are accumulating for some serious shifts. When I argue with our economists, well, not really argue, I can't really argue with them. They obviously know dozens of times more than I do. But I tell them, guys, of course, you're doing a great job. You give us such forecasts that make you want to just throw up your hands and, so to speak, move somewhere far away, like New Zealand, to raise rabbits. But still, I think your forecasts aren't quite right because you don't take human factors into account. The factor of fatigue, the factor of morality, the factor of being right, and so on. The factor in the end of courage, bravery, resilience. They say, well, yes, yes, yes. You're kind of, we only provide the economics, we only give the numbers, we only show the trends, we only present the statistics. And you, the politicians, should look further and see what can be done by political means. We're simply telling you what's happening in the economy with sanctions, with these kinds of tools. And you, the politicians, draw conclusions and come up with what can be done, using political, diplomatic, and other means in order, so to speak, to bring down this regime. Therefore, of course, when I talk about the economic situation, which doesn't give us much reason for optimism, we shouldn't forget that other things are happening, which you're mentioning now. The accumulation of preconditions, splits within this ultra-patriotic camp, which are quite obvious and public, and the growing fatigue. For some, an awakening conscience is also a factor that cannot be discounted, so all of this is happening. Plus, of course, I've spoken, let's say, with people close to big business, and they say that all of this, all the profitability has dropped for large businesses. There are some that are close to His Imperial, to His Majesty, but for the most part, no, there are no longer those super profits that existed back in 2023 to 2024. Everything has dropped, especially in civilian sectors, especially out in the regions. Still, of course, there are problems and they are accumulating, they keep piling up. Of course, Russia is being pushed out of the ranks of developed countries into the third world because there is no technological progress, no scientific advancement. But all of this, you see, is just accumulating. When it will break through in a new form, when it will have an effect, we simply don't know. What could change things in Russia? Extremely strong emotions. You see, the mindset of most people on the planet, especially Russians, is not rational, it's emotional. If there are no emotions, it's hard to expect any sudden changes. Sudden changes always happen when there are strong emotions. People perceive the world more emotionally than rationally. Only a small number perceive things rationally, let's say at most 15 to 20%. Gennady, I really hope that next week when we meet, Pete Hegseth, let's say the Minister of War, wrote this post about Venezuela today. I really hope that next week we'll at least be able to discuss the beginning with you of the United States operation to overthrow the Maduro regime, because at least then there would be some kind of push, some kind of result.
For a new discussion, at least if that happens, there will be more hope that
It will be a public flogging, a public punishment of an out-of-control dictator. And we shouldn't forget, not only in a military sense, but also politically in general. The dictator was captured and the choice was made. The one who threatened the world there, the one who said, "We'll tear you all apart like a hot water bottle," was taken down. And then suddenly, bang, and he's gone.
yes, this will indeed be a clear signal and message to Putin, the Russian leader.
It will be a signal to everyone, not just Putin.
Friends, please like this video and write in the comments what you think about the situation overall and where you're watching us from. Every like and every subscription from you is very important to us because when you like and subscribe, this video reaches as many people as possible around the world. And that is our goal. The well-known opposition figure Gennady Kutkov. Gennady Vladimirovich, thank you and see you next week.